I heard the scrape before I saw them, the rubber soles on tile, the soft thud of something being dragged, the crinkle of plastic that makes your skin go cold. I followed the sound down the hallway and found my life in black garbage bags, stacked like grim trophies in the middle of the living room. He wasn't looking at me. He was bent over a bag, pushing a sweater inside, as if packing for a trip. The new woman I had barely met stood beside him with her arms crossed, like she owned all of it already. "Mom," he said, not even turning, "you'll be more comfortable in the garage." Those words were a stone. I remember the way the light hit his jaw, the way his voice was flat, practiced. I remember the smell of the lemon cleaner on the counter, the dirty rain outside, and the way everything ordinary in the house, the rocking chair, the yellow folder of his childhood drawings, the chipped teacups my husband loved, looked suddenly fragile and foreign. If you're new here, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I want to know we're not alone in this. This is how it began. Not with a fight, not with a single loud betrayal, but with small motions that gathered like smoke until the room was full. I had spent 40 years of my life keeping this house, sweeping floors at midnight after a hospital shift, mending knees and pride with the same needle, sitting up with my husband when his breathing stuttered and praying, watching my son sleep, imagining him a man of honor. I never imagined sleeping on a garage mattress with the neighbor's cats watching me from the rafters. The memory of him at 3 years old comes to me like a photograph. He had crayons in his hair and a sticky face from the jam I spread on his toast. He rested his head against my chest, and I hummed that lullaby my mother used to hum, the one with no words, just the way the melody softened when the house grew quiet. He would drag his small blankets into the living room and build forts under the table. I can still see one of his drawings, yellowed at the edges, a crooked house with 3 stick people, and a sun that looked like a fingerprint. I kept that drawing in a folder in a bottom drawer for years, like a relic. I sold my car to help pay his tuition. Not all at once, but a little at a time, small sacrifices until they added up. I drove the bus to the hospital in the afternoons, did extra shifts, baked bread to sell at the church bake sale, simply because I could see his eyes when he put on that cap and gown. He used to call me on his way home from classes, full of plans. He told me once, half laughing, "One day you'll be proud of me, Ma." I didn't know then that pride could be used like a weight against someone. The woman arrived like a new season, at first soft as a spring rain. She smiled for dinner visits, brought flowers, said the right things. I welcomed her at the door because I had always opened the house. My husband would have wanted us to be warm to guests. But warmth curdled into a stranger's coldness before I could comprehend it. She had opinions about my cooking. She rearranged the pictures on the mantel, didn't ask, just moved them. She said things in a tone like advice, not conversation. At first, it was small cuts. Jokes about the food being old-fashioned made at parties where I laughed along because I thought she was teasing. Comments about my outfits that felt like needles. A sneer when I mentioned something I had done for the house years ago. My son laughed at first. Then he started to nod, as if agreeing with her by default. The house changed its voice. Where my husband and I had once set the rhythms, now someone else suggested a new timetable. The first birthday she missed, my 70th, hurt more than any insult. My son told me they had other plans, that she'd already bought something special. I trimmed a cake alone and put the candle out by myself. The neighbors came by with a pot of stew and sat with me in the kitchen while I cried in the sink. Constance, the neighbor across the fence who'd baked me pies for 20 years, brought a bouquet of daffodils and held my hand. "Don't let them make you small," she told me, and I didn't know how to do anything but keep my hands folded until the sting in my throat faded. Little rules crept in like ivy. She didn't like the way the curtains were hung. The living room rug was outdated. Our heirloom silverware was so heavy for her liking. and it disappeared into a hallway drawer that became hers to command. Sometimes he would speak for me in the kitchen, telling me to let her do things differently, and something inside me hardened. I had taught him to be gracious, to treat people with kindness, but grace is not the same as surrender. The wedding was the first public rupture. My son married her quietly. There were only family and a few friends. I set the table myself the night before, polishing until the silver reflected the lamp's light. At the ceremony, she stood apart from me. Her smile for the guests did not reach her eyes. At dinner, plates skipped my place in the seating plan. I pressed my lips together and laughed at the jokes, as one does, but each omission was a small knife. Later, I learned she had told him I didn't belong at certain things, that I was too old-fashioned for family photos. He let the words pass him by, not because he believed them, but because he came to accept her framing as truth. Things piled up quietly. Invitations I didn't receive. Decisions about home repairs in which my opinion was never consulted. A refrigerator pulley that went broken and was fixed by her choice of a brand without asking me. If I protested, his answer was the same. That's how she wants it. His voice grew flat. The man I had kissed at the hospital door when our son was born became a stranger with the outline of my son's face. I told myself I was imagining things. Denial is a friend who keeps you walking through a storm, because otherwise the wind might topple you. So I cleaned, and I made suppers, and I swallowed the words burning at the back of my throat. I am proud of what I built with my hands and sweat. Pride is the only measure I have against humiliation. But humiliation has its own slow gravity, and one night the gravity won. That night I was folding linens when I heard feet heavy in the hallway. I thought it was the radio or a neighbor coming in from rain. I looked up and saw my son's shoulders bent over a trash bag, the new woman beside him. He said nothing at first. He placed my knitted shawl into a bag, as if it were not the shawl his father had wrapped around his shoulders in winter. He put the teacups, chipped but ours, in a way that made them clink with a sound that felt like mockery. "You can sleep in the garage," he said, with that same flatness. He turned, and for a second I thought I might have misheard. He repeated it slowly, sending the sentence like a dart. "There's room out there. It'll be fine." Fine. The word sat on my skin like cold rain. I looked at him. I looked at the woman. Their faces were small and unfamiliar inside a house that used to be alive with the noise of ordinary love. I remember the floorboards under my feet. I remember water on my hands from the sink. I remember the thought that this could not be happening here, not in the house where my husband had held my wrist during his last breath, where his fingerprints still lived in the varnish of the kitchen table. I packed a sweater into a bag. The hands that had once held me steady were trembling. My hands, which sewed school uniforms and hemmed curtains and opened jars when his fingers had arthritis, moved with a kind of automatic calm. I did not scream. There was no need. The house was stripped of the right to my anger. The anger caught and folded itself into the fabric of things. The garage smelled like oil and old newspapers. The mattress they put out for me was thin and stained. In the first hour there, I lay and listened to the pipes sing to the night. At 3 a.m, the cold came, and I wrapped my shawl tighter and pressed my cheek to the pillow, and thought of my son's face as a little boy again. The light under the door told me it was rain. The muffled footstep of a dog next door reminded me I was not invisible. Still, the shame is a private thing, and it wrapped around my chest in a way that made breathing an act of effort. Neighbors came and went like a tide. Constance set a thermos on the porch and left it wrapped in a bag with a note, "Eat, Maria." Marisa from next door brought a blanket and sat with me on the stoop, offering a cigarette and then holding it while I decided I didn't want it. Mr. Joe, who had been a postman for 30 years, handed me an envelope with a few dollars inside. "You don't have to thank me," he said, "but you could tell me when you need a hand with the grass. That's what neighbors do." Their quiet solidarity warmed me in a way nothing else did. To be seen by people who remembered me as I was felt like a secret blessing. In the garage, nights stretched. I would wake to the sound of the house settling and wonder if he had pushed a box out of the window to make room, and then shake my head, telling myself that I would go back upstairs in the morning. The mornings were worse. On some days, she would open the front door and glide past with a bag of groceries, and I would see her through a small slit in the curtain, arranging things like someone staging a scene in which I do not exist. Once, I watched her replace the faded curtains my husband had sewn with bright ones from a store. She smiled at a delivery driver and not at me. Humiliation erodes small pleasures. The shape of my day changed. I stopped reaching for the phone because it meant seeing his name light up and wondering if this is the moment he would ask if I was settled. I stopped setting two places at dinner because the table did not belong to me anymore. I kept reciting the lullaby my mother had hummed, like an incantation that might summon back the person I had been. On one night, there was a knock. It was Sister Rosa, my sister, who has always been more blunt than kind, and I was grateful for the bluntness. She opened the garage door and looked at me like someone measuring a fault line. "You don't deserve this," she said. Her voice was steady. "Come inside." I told her it wasn't that simple, as if complexity could justify the betrayal. She listened. She set a kettle on the counter and poured tea for us both. She did not offer platitudes, only a steady presence. "We'll sort it," she said. "We'll sort it, Maria." Sorting is a verb I used to use for mending clothes or organizing bills. Sorting as an act of reclaiming was unfamiliar. I found myself thinking about papers, a silly thought at first, then one that expanded until it filled me with a strange focus. In the years I had carried this house in my hands, I had kept receipts for repairs, property tax notices in a wooden box, the deed to the house folded under a calendar. I had always kept those things close because my husband and I had acquired this house on a mortgage and then 1,000 payments and small repairs, and the sense that we had earned the right to rest within it. I had never doubted ownership. I had never imagined anyone would try to take not the physical floorboards, but the dignity of the life we built. Weeks passed like this, humiliation balanced with the kindness of a community. The more the days threatened to pull me apart, the more I clung to little rituals that tethered me to myself, sweeping the stoop each morning, making coffee at dawn, watching the paperboy toss the local paper like a small promise. When the house felt too heavy, I would go for walks and watch children with their backpacks and imagine my son as one of them once, full of care and wonder and plaster on his knees. Then there was the night of the argument. I had gone upstairs to get a sweater, an act of defiance that felt as small as the button on a shirt. There was a sound of voices, and when I pushed the door open, she was scolding him about money in a voice that had no softness. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, shoulders trembling, as if he were on the edge of something he could not name. "You're not listening," she said. "We can't be responsible for everything. She needs to go. It's better for all of us." "You don't understand," he said. The way he looked at me then, like he had just noticed a painting in the corner of a room, was gutting. I realized then that he had stopped seeing me as the same person who had hummed lullabies and fixed shirts and sat up at night when his father was sick. To him, I had been moved to the margins. To her, I was an obstacle. "I won't fight you," I told them later, when the house had gone quiet and the moon traced a pale hand through the kitchen window. There was iron in my voice that surprised me. "But I won't be treated like a guest in my own home." They laughed once, twin sounds that were more bitter than the words. "You always take things so seriously," she said, which is to say that she did not understand how much was at stake for me. For some people, a house is a place where they lay their head. For me, it is a ledger of decades, nights at the hospital, the day my husband and I planted the oak tree in the yard, the first time I saw my son in the light. It is a geography of memory. The night they pushed me into the garage, I had gathered a bag, but not the things that mattered. The yellow folder, the wooden soldier my husband carved, the photographs. I had planned to go back the next morning to retrieve them discreetly, to avoid confrontation. But what I encountered that next morning was not misplacement, but malicious efficiency. Black bags lined the driveway. Some of my things had been taken to the curb, as if I had already been judged and found wanting. Anger rose then like heat. This time it wasn't humiliation alone, but a furious clarity. They believed they could rewrite the story of my life by changing the order of objects in a house. They thought that by moving a picture frame, they could erase a history. I stood by the curb and watched children on their way to school, and wondered when exactly my role had been turned from mother into inconvenience. That evening, after everyone else had retreated, I sat in the garage and felt the weight of silence. I pulled the thin mattress up against the wall and curled like a thing trying to preserve heat. The neighbor's dog sniffed at the bottom of the door and then curled up at my feet. I slept a while and woke with my hand closed around the edge of something that had snagged the sheet. I reached into the darkness and felt the texture of paper, thick and cold. My fingers found an envelope. It was old and dust-marked, the glue long gone, and when I eased it open, the smell of old paper and a faint trace of my husband's pipe tobacco rose up like a memory. I didn't look at the contents at first. I held the envelope to my face as if I could inhale the years like a medicine. When I finally drew the paper out, I saw a folded document with my husband's scrawl and the stamped lines of a courthouse. My breath left me. There were receipts tucked inside, property tax notices, a small note from the time we had replaced the roof, the name of a surveyor. Beneath the receipts, a thicker sheet bore the word deed in a language of ink that had softened with time. My name was written on it beside my husband's. For a moment the world tipped, and standing in the dim garage, the edges of years became very sharp. I thought of throwing it away. I thought that perhaps the sight of it was a trick, and that it could not change the way my son had thrown my life into plastic bags. But paper has a stubbornness. It is proof of what was, and sometimes that proof is the chisel that breaks open what has been falsely built atop it. I sat there with the document on my knees and felt something like a plan begin to form. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't happiness. It was the slow, reasonable rise of someone remembering their own center. Memory holds facts. Facts can be laid out. Lawyering, as I later learned, is simply turning facts into words that someone in a suit will listen to. I turned the paper over and over in the light of the single bulb and realized I had what I needed to begin a conversation that would not be hushed in the kitchen. When people tell stories like mine, they often skip the small, quieter motions. The way you fold a receipt, the way you set a document on the mantel to look at it later, the way you breathe when you realize something that could change everything is in your hands. In that garage, under a thin bulb and the hum of the refrigerator from the house beyond the wall, I felt the center of my life realign like a compass finding north. I thought of the neighbors who had held my hand without asking for anything, of Sister Rosa's blunt courage. I thought of my son as a child again, knees scraped, pleased with Crayola colors. I thought of my husband and his slow, steady hands. I didn't know then the name of the man who would become central to the next chapter, the lawyer who would, with calm precision, look at a stack of paper and say things that would make my son sit on the porch and realize he had been wrong. I only knew that there was a document that belonged to me and that the house had been mine in a way more than sentimental. That night I tucked the papers into my shawl and held them close. I let myself imagine the small dignity of walking back into the house and setting the deed on the kitchen table like a lamp that would illuminate truth. The plan that bubbled up was not theatrical. It was a set of small steps built from the stubbornness that had gotten me through late-night shifts and hospital corridors. Find a witness, find the papers, find a calm voice that would say the right words. I cleaned my hands on an old towel and watched the moon trace a line along the garage floor. The house above me slept with the soft authority of years. Within the shadow of the rafters, I made a promise to myself I hadn't spoken aloud. I would not accept being pushed out of the map of my life. Whatever came next would not be loud or vengeful, it would be precise. The next morning, I carried the envelope to the kitchen table as if it were a fragile bird and set it among the crumbs of breakfast. I wanted to be careful with it, to not let my son's anger become the only story. I sat with the paper and with my hands folded, and I let the facts sit in front of me. Outside, the street carried on with its daily rituals. The bus huffed down the lane, a runner passed by with earphones, and a paper bag of oranges sat at the door. Inside, the house had shifted, but some things remained faithful. I did not yet have a lawyer. I did not yet have an argument fashioned in legal terms. I had instead the stubborn proof of a life and the sense that something could be done. The decision was not sudden. It was a series of small acknowledgments. That dignity is not the same as stubbornness. That the law is a mechanism I might use to draw a fair line. That forgiveness does not require erasing harm. When the doorbell rang that afternoon, I almost did not move. The sound startled me, the way it had when we were young and a visitor might bring news of work or marriage or a newborn. I wiped my hands on my skirt and opened the door a crack. My neighbor, Constance, stood there with a casserole and a look that had both sorrow and steel. "They're talking," she said. "It's quiet at first, but Mrs. Marisa said she heard them in the street this morning. They think they'll force you out sooner than later." My hands tightened on the casserole. "Sooner than later," I echoed. The phrase had a heaviness to it, a schedule to our humiliation. "Don't do anything rash," Constance said, "but don't let them take from you what you didn't give away." Her words were taught with experience. She had been married 42 years and had seen kinships fray and shading. She set the casserole on the counter and touched my cheek briefly. "You should call someone," she said. "A calm voice who can look at those papers with you." The idea of introducing a stranger into my life made me uneasy. But the thought of my son and that woman rearranging my world with no check on them made my shoulders remember old strengths. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the deed and the receipts and a small printed file of property tax notices, each date like a heartbeat. My hand shook when I signed the radio on to find out the time, a ritual to feel less alone. Before I went further, I took the deed to the window and held it up to the light. The ink had faded in places, but the names were legible, my husband's and mine. A line of numbers, an old stamp from the county recorder. It was more than a piece of caper. It was a map of a life that had been tended and paid for by work and prayer and 1,000 small sacrifices. It did not, by itself, guarantee anything in any courthouse, but it was a fact, and facts have a way of making a strong narrative, that we had been here first, that our hands had helped raise this house from foundation to rafters. I told myself, as if settling a tea, that the next step was to find a calm voice who would translate those facts into a language someone else would heed. I didn't yet know Dr. Rodrigo's name. I only knew I would need someone who would not shout and would not make the scene worse. Someone who would look at a stack of receipts and say, "There is a history here." I thought of lawyers like the men and women who had come through the courthouse doors in movies, stern, precise. I wanted someone who would be precise, not theatrical. That night I made a list. It is a practice I have always used when life feels overwhelming. Write things down, one by one, until the jumble of emotion yields to the order of ink. The list had headings. Under Documents, I wrote Deed, Property Tax Receipts 1998-2019, Utility Bills, Receipts for Roof Repair 2012, Pocket Photographs. Under Witnesses, I wrote Constance, Marisa, Joe, Sister Rosa. Under Goal, I wrote Keep the House, Reassert Dignity, Avoid Confrontation. It was late when I folded the list and pinned it to the bulletin board with an old magnet that had a chipped picture of a lighthouse. I went to bed in the garage with the envelope under my pillow. I closed my eyes and let the lullaby memory wrap around me, like a promise that the voice of the years would not be erased by a season of cold. When morning came, the mailbox held an advertisement and nothing else. But my heart was different. There was a plan, delicate as a lace handkerchief, but made of iron threads. I would find the calm voice. I would speak the facts. I would call on neighbors to witness. I would not make dramatic vows of revenge. I would not use the law like a hammer. I simply wanted what is reasonable, to live in the house I had helped make, to keep the small sacred places where my husband's hands had been, and to be treated like the person who had been both mother and keeper of that home. The doorbell rang again that afternoon. This time I answered it without hesitation. A man stood there in a gray coat with gray hair at his temples and a folder under his arm. He introduced himself simply, with a voice that was not loud but not timid. "Dr. Rodrigo," he said, "I'm a lawyer. Constance told me you might need someone to look at some papers." He smiled as if to disarm me. There was a steadiness in his manner that told me he had seen many things and that he was not easily surprised. He did not make grand promises or lean in with false sympathy. He asked to come in, and I let him. As he sat at the kitchen table and gently unfolded the paper I had placed before him, I watched his fingers trace the lines like a man reading the rings of a tree. "These are important," he said after a time. "They show a continuity, evidence that can be used to support your claim to the property. We'll need to organize them, make copies, and prepare a formal notice if you wish. There are processes to follow, and I'll be with you every step. But first, it's crucial to document everything that has happened." He looked up at me then in a way that felt like recognition rather than pity. "I can't promise a certain outcome," he added. "No lawyer can. But I can promise to work with the facts." His words were small and contained. They did not offer salvation, only the practical assurance of someone willing to translate fact into action. That in itself was a kind of confession, not the fanciful kind the title of this story might suggest, but the real kind, an admission that the law can give voice to neglected facts, and that someone who knows the language can make those facts heard. I told him everything, from the little jokes that had become knives to the night I slept in the garage. He listened without interrupting, his pen resting on a pad, a quiet instrument. When I finished, he folded his hands and said, "Therefore, we'll need witnesses, copies, and a measured approach. We'll consider a formal notice, a clear step that gives the occupants time to respond while asserting your rights." It was not dramatic. There was no sudden courtroom drama, no gavel pounding. There was instead the steady arranging of facts, a type of confession in which the lawyer quietly laid out the path forward, and in doing so, revealed that the truth, once given form, can do something practical. He asked me to bring every scrap of paper I could find, every receipt, every photograph. We made an appointment for the following week to prepare a packet. He said he would also speak discreetly to a court officer if necessary. When I closed the door after he left, I felt the world tilt. Not in the way that people imagine when they think of miraculous turns, no blinding light, no sudden transformation, but in the practical sense. A man who worked in the language of facts had agreed to walk the path with me. The confession the title hinted at had not yet come, but already there was the sense that someone would read those papers and say plainly, "This is your house." I laid the documents on the table again, smoothing them as if they were fragile linens. The deed sat there like an anchor. The idea of standing at the door while someone delivered an official notice appealed to a part of me that wanted to be heard out loud, in a language others understood. There is dignity in process, I thought, a dignity that doesn't demand performance but insists on recognition. That night I slept with a small glimmer of something that felt like hope. Hope is not a promise. Hope is the willingness to plan and the patience to act. I had come to realize that dignity is not only feeling proud in your chest, but setting a boundary in the world so it knows where you stand. The next days were a mix of small preparations and the ordinary business of living. Constance came by with more casseroles. Joe offered to mow the small front lawn until things settle. And Marisa brought over a stack of old photographs she had found at a garage sale and thought might belong to me. Each small kindness cushioned the rough edges of the days. And yet, beneath the gentleness, there was a current of fear. What would happen when someone from outside knocked at the door and read aloud a notice? Would my son peel back the curtain of indifference and finally see what he had done? How would his wife react? Would I be blamed for making his life difficult? These were the dark questions I turned and turned like stones in my palm. On a wet morning, when the air smelled of cut grass and rain, I sat at the kitchen table with the deeds spread before me. The ink seemed to glow in the soft light. I thought of my husband and of the nights we had tightened bolts on the porch swing and painted shutters until dawn. I thought of the nights I had worked in the hospital and come home to a house that wrapped around me like a blanket. For a long time, I had equated holding the home with the holding of memory. Today, holding the paper felt the same. I folded the deed carefully and placed it in an envelope, this time closing it and writing on the outside for Dr. Rodrigo. The label felt significant, as if the small act of addressing it might summon the gravity of the next step. When the envelope left my hands, carried by my neighbor to the clinic where Dr. Rodrigo worked, I felt the first real movement of the story changing. It was not yet resolved, it was not yet redeemed, but it was in motion. At the door, as Constance shut the gate behind her, I could hear my son's voice echo in the kitchen, a low conversation muffled by the house. For a moment, I felt as though I stood at a threshold not just of a house, but of a life that was choosing whether to include me. I thought of the little boy who had once slept on my chest, of the man who would soon be faced with the evidence of his mother's place in the world. I did not know then how the conversation would unfold, what the lawyer would say, or what his confession would sound like when he revealed the facts in a language the house's new occupants could not ignore. I only knew that I had chosen not to be erased, and that some truths, when laid out plainly on paper and in the presence of witnesses, have a gravity of their own. The kettle clicked in the background. The house smelled of coffee. I stood at the window and watched the street for a while, letting the ordinary world move past, a passerby with a dog, a cyclist with a child, the mail carrier's familiar figure. The small constellations of ordinary life continued, indifferent to my turmoil. But within me, something had shifted. I had changed from a woman who waited to one who would act. I folded the shawl around my shoulders, a thin armor, and reached for the yellow folder where the child's drawings slept. I ran my thumb along the edge of the paper and thought, whatever happens next, I will hold on to the truth of what we lived. My life is not the sum of other people's opinions. When the phone rang that afternoon, I was ready to answer. When the phone rang that afternoon, I was ready to answer. The voice on the other end was calm and precise, Dr. Rodrigo. He had a way of speaking that made complexity sound like a simple path, steady footsteps on a tiled floor. He told me he had reviewed the copies I dropped at his office and wanted to meet at the house the next morning, to walk through the rooms with me, and to speak, if I wanted, with a court officer afterward. He arrived on a clear Monday in a dark coat that didn't try to be dramatic. He carried a folder and wore the kind of quiet face people put on when they mean business without noise. He did not call himself a savior. He did not promise fireworks. He listened as I pointed to the living room, the mantel with the photographs, the kitchen table, the oak tree my husband and I had planted the first year after the house was paid off. "We'll proceed with respect," he said, and that phrase was more powerful to me than any promise. He explained in the simplest terms what he planned: organize the documents, gather witnesses, prepare an official notice to be served, and have a neutral officer deliver it so the process was respectful and incontestable. He made one point clear: no theatrics, only procedure. When facts are clear and presented properly, he said, the truth becomes hard to ignore. He called it a formality, though I had learned not to take such small words lightly. He described how a court officer would hand a written notice informing the occupants that the owner asserted her right to possession and giving them an opportunity to respond within 30 days. He was careful with his language. He didn't tell me it would end one way or another. He said what he could do was put the facts forward in an orderly way and ensure that a neutral officer presented those facts. He called it a formality, though I had learned not to take such small words lightly. He described how a court officer would hand a written notice informing the occupants that the owner asserted her right to possession and giving them an opportunity to respond within 30 days. He was careful with his language. He didn't tell me it would end one way or another. He said what he could do was put the facts forward in an orderly way and ensure that a neutral officer presented those facts. The confession I would later think of, his moment of revealing the facts so plainly they could no longer be sidestepped, was not a dramatic admission of guilt, but a quiet, professional statement. The records and the history of the property show your name. The occupants are being notified. We spent the afternoon preparing. He copied tax receipts, scanned the deed, and made neat, methodical stacks of printed pages. I watched him as he worked and felt something like relief, a man translating the language I was not fluent in. Between his pen strokes, he asked for names, neighbors, dates, small details to corroborate my account. I gave him Constance, Marisa, Joe, Sister Rosa. He asked if anyone could testify about the pattern of occupation, about the nights I had slept upstairs and the times I had paid for repairs. I told him what I knew, and he wrote it down, without judgment, as an archivist of a life. "We'll invite them to sign statements," he said, "not to create drama, but to document testimony. Small things, clear things." He added, "Be prepared that the occupants may respond emotionally. They might attempt to persuade you to drop the matter. Decide now what you want so you won't be pulled from your center." Later, while he was organizing the packet, I thought how strange it was to be told to prepare my heart as much as my paperwork. He was right. Facts alone do not make the hardest choices easy. Standing firm does. The day the notice would be served, Dr. Rodrigo told me, would be quiet. He arranged for a court officer, someone whose presence is meant to be procedural and neutral, to come to the house and hand the papers over. He suggested inviting the neighbors. Witnesses matter, he said. They prevent a narrative being rewritten. I called Constance and Sister Rosa myself, with hands that didn't feel the tremor I imagined they might. I asked them to be present at the front yard shortly before noon. When the morning came, the sky was a pale, wet blue. The house seemed smaller somehow, as if it were holding its breath. I set 2 teacups on the porch and then retrieved them because I did not want hospitality mistaken for weakness. Constance arrived with a casserole. She stood at the gate as if guarding it. Sister Rosa came wearing the same blunt expression she had kept when I was a child, and she was scolding me for climbing trees. Marisa and Joe hovered at windows, the kind of anxious presence neighbors acquire when they love someone enough to be worried. They arrived. Dr. Rodrigo, the court officer in a plain suit, and a small woman carrying a clipboard. The officer introduced herself politely. Her face had the dispassionate softness of someone who had read formal notices on many doorsteps. After formalities, she asked if I wished to be present while she served the notice. I did. We waited on the porch as the front door opened. My son answered almost immediately, as if he had been at the threshold waiting for conflict to arrive. He was pale and looked thin in a way I had not wanted to see. Beside him, she stood with arms folded, a stance that had become familiar. For a moment he didn't speak. He looked at the people on the porch as if searching for their purpose. The court officer spoke first. She read from the document with the voice of someone who told time and dates. This notice is to inform you that the property located at address is titled in the name of Maria Helena, last name. The owner has asserted her right to possession and is requesting the occupants vacate within 30 days of this notice. She held up a copy, and the paper caught the light and became, for a heartbeat, an irrefutable object. My son's shoulders dropped like a breath released. "Mama," he said, stepping forward, voice tight. He reached for my hand. I could feel the calluses where once he had been a child and then a young man who called from bus rides and graduation. He looked at Dr. Rodrigo then, not at me, and something in his face unspooled, a mixture of anger and shame and a dawning comprehension. She reacted with fury. "You and your lawyer," she said, voice sharp like a blade. "You brought strangers to harass us in our home." She pushed past the officer to the edge of the porch and cursed in a way I had seldom heard her curse, short, fast words that were meant to wound. The court officer remained composed. "This is an official notice," she said, and that phrase seemed to deflate the heat. "It is not harassment. It is a legal communication." "I can explain," my son said, grabbing at the air. He looked at me as if pleading for an ally in a way he had not done for years. "It wasn't like this. We were trying to make things better." "Making things better doesn't erase people's lives," I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. I didn't want to be dragged into an argument that would make the day a spectacle. This house has been mine and my husband's. I have lived here. I have paid taxes. That is what this document shows. Dr. Rodrigo stepped forward then, and his presence changed the air the way a calm wind steadies a wavering flame. He addressed my son directly, with a firmness that was not unkind. "I understand there are emotions here. My role is not to judge family choices, but to make sure legal facts are clear. The deed, tax receipts, and witness statements show Miss Maria Helena as the owner. This notice simply communicates the owner's decision to assert possession and provides 30 days' time. If your family wants to discuss an agreement, that is possible. If not, this process gives you time to consider your options." He did not say, "You are wrong," in a way meant to shame. He spoke in a tone that laid out reality. I saw pain flash over my son's face, like a curtain revealing an empty room behind it, and an instinct to fix what had been broken. He turned to his wife. She stared at the page as if reading a spell. Fury burned, and then turned to a brittle silence. There were words then, rising and falling like waves. Friends who lived nearby gathered at the end of the sidewalk. Mr. Joe, his hat in hand, stood with the dignity of a man who had delivered mail and stories. Constance put a hand gently on my arm. Sister Rosa planted her feet like a stern tree. The neighbors' presence mattered more than any speech. They were witnesses not just to the paper, but to the life the paper represented. He begged, on his knees if not literally. He begged in short sentences and tempered appeals. "Mama, please, let's talk. Give me a chance to make this right." His voice cracked on the last word. I felt the child still inside, pleading for forgiveness. I also felt the woman who had kept night vigils for 30 years, who had sewn patches and paid bills and pressed the warmth back into a home when life had taken heat away. I thought about forgiveness. I thought about the lullaby I hummed. Forgiveness is a gift for the forgiver, not a currency for the forgiven. I had to decide if reconciling inside the house meant surrendering the very boundaries that protected my dignity. I had to decide if I would use legal papers as a way to punish or as a means to re-establish the life that was mine. "Your apologies won't move these papers," Dr. Rodrigo said gently before I could reply. "They won't erase the weeks she slept in the garage or the things taken to the curb. But apologies can be a beginning, outside the framework of the house. Decide what you want to repair and what you need to leave in the past." My son looked like a man who had been unmasked, then repainted in haste. He said, "I'll find a place. We'll go. We don't want to make you uncomfortable." She laughed once, a high sound that had no humor. "You think a piece of paper scares us away? We will not be bullied. You think you can sign a stack of paper and throw us on the street?" Her words carried venom, but also a brittle insecurity. The officer remained quiet and handed the copy of the notice to my son, who took it with hands that trembled. He turned it over and over, as if the ink might rearrange itself into a kinder script. They didn't leave that day. The notice gave them 30 days. The days that followed were heavy in their own way, an awkward mix of provocation and attempts at placation. There were calls in the night, messages left on my phone with testimonials of pain and promises of change. Once he left a note under my door with a child's drawing and a line, "I love you, Ma, I'm sorry." The drawing was small and crooked, as if the hands that made it had practiced tenderness. I kept it in my pocket for a day, then placed it with the other papers, neither rejecting it nor letting it erase what had been done. The first week after the notice, she tried to push every boundary. She rearranged the kitchen again and accused me of being difficult. She invited friends to dinner and omitted me from the table setting, and a repair was ordered without telling me. Each act was a test for my resolve. Each time I called Dr. Rodrigo, and he reminded me to document everything. "Write the dates," he said. "Record the disruptions. Keep copies. If you will be ridiculed for wanting to live in peace, then we will make the record ourselves." Neighbors continued to witness. Marisa left a bowl on my porch. Joe mowed my lawn when I couldn't bear to stand. Constance sat with me on the back step and spoke little. Her silence conveyed more solidarity than many speeches. Sister Rosa visited daily, always finding a chore that needed doing and doing it as if chores were love. The small kindnesses added up to something sturdy. As the weeks folded into one another, there were attempts at persuasion. My son tried to meet for coffee. He called me to suggest we work things out, as if that phrase could be shaped to mean something tender. I met him once on a bench in the park near the post office. He arrived with that guilty, earnest look of a man trying to reconstruct a life he had unmade. He spoke about the pressure they had felt, about decisions made in panic, about the arrival of debt and how they had been scared. He asked if I would consider letting them stay, if they agreed to certain terms, to give them a chance. I listened. I could see the tremor under his words. He didn't shout, he didn't attack. He told his side with a mix of shame and deflection. In the end, I told him the truth without wanting to wound him more than he already was. "I will not make you homeless," I said. "I will not enjoy your pain. But I will not let my life be diminished. If you want to stay as family, it has to be in a new shape, one that respects the history of this home and the person who built it." He couldn't promise that. He could promise words, not the embodied change the house needed. He left with hands in his pockets and a small paper tucked in his palm. There was a night, 3 weeks in, when the tension snapped. It was a late evening and rain drummed lightly on the roof. I sat at the kitchen table, a small lamp throwing a pool of light over the deed. I had rearranged the photographs on the mantel back to the way they had been years ago. It felt like tracing a map with my fingertip, finding the routes I had not lost. There was a knock at the door. Expecting an apology or another note, I opened it and found her standing there, rain on her hair, eyes raw. "I'm leaving," she said, voice surprising me with its lack of triumph. For a moment I thought she was making a last taunt. She hadn't expected me to hear that. "We're leaving. It's me, not him." She looked like a woman who had found a choice and chosen it. "You were right," she added, and the words landed like a pebble in a quiet pool. "This is her home. I can't keep pretending it isn't." I took her in like one does a portrait seen anew. studied the face that had been so sharp toward me, and felt a strange pity. "Then go," I said. "Go with dignity. Take what is yours, and don't make this worse." She nodded and left, like a winded sparrow. That night my son came to the door and placed a box in my hands with his eyes lowered. It was awkward and small, the kind of exchange that hopes for a truce in the shape of cardboard. He said little. The next morning the moving van arrived. It would have been satisfying to say the house was suddenly restored, that the porch rang with laughter and the trees sighed in relief. The truth is more modest. They left slowly, with arguments and tears, in a way that left marks but not permanent scars. The moving van came, the boxes went, and the house felt like a place reclaiming its voice bit by bit. There were days when I walked through rooms and felt a weight lift, and other times when the absence of shouting left a hollowness. A few weeks after they left, Dr. Rodrigo met me at the courthouse. Not for a trial, but to file a small formal note confirming the service of the notice and the movements that had occurred. He spoke with the measured tone of a man who knew legal language and human frailty both. "I'm not celebrating," he told me as we walked back to the car. "We did what the facts allowed us to do. You did what you needed to do to be treated with respect." That was the confession in a non-sensational way. He had confessed that when facts are arranged with clarity, the language of law can realign the life of a household. He had revealed that the quiet machinery of justice, when used with dignity and careful witnesses, can be more effective than grief or shouts. The neighborhood noticed the change too. The woman who had come as winter and gone in spring left traces, some permanent, like the new curtains, and others easily replaced. We recovered the silverware from the drawer where it had been hidden and set it on the table with a polish that felt ceremonial. I bought new curtains, not because the old ones had to be replaced, but because I wanted to make a small ritual of reasserting the environment of my home. I rehung photographs in their old order and sat a little longer in the rocking chair, because being in that chair reminded me that pieces of my life have anchors. The community's presence did not evaporate with the van. Constance came by with fresh bread. Sister Rosa and I planted marigolds along the sidewalk. Joe fixed the mailbox. These acts were not heroic. They were everyday affirmations that someone remembers you as you are, not as others wished you would be. They wove a soft safety net under the place where I most needed one. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. I began to reclaim small pleasures: tea in the afternoon, dusting the bookshelves, watching sparrows argue about nest locations. I joined a senior group at the local community center. The meetings were filled with knitting needles and stories and, surprisingly, laughter. I found myself volunteering once a week in a reading program for children, sitting in a circle and reading aloud odd tales that made them squeal with delighted horror. It was a small thing to sit with a book and let a child clap at the end, but it felt like rebuilding. The house outside served as frame, the community inside as mortar. My son tried again, months later, to stitch something back. He called with cautious words, sent messages with care, and once came to the porch with his head bowed as if in prayer. He brought pictures of his days, of places he thought I might like, of attempts to be better. He apologized. He said he was seeing a counselor. He asked if I could come to his wife's new apartment for a tea. He wanted a kind of restored proximity. I told him, with all the tenderness and firmness I could gather, that there are different kinds of reconciliation. Some wounds require time and change and restitution over months and years. Others require boundaries to keep the person who caused harm from repeating it in the same place. "I forgive you," I said once in a gentle voice. But forgiveness is not the same as reopening doors I closed to protect myself. We will have a relationship, but it will be shaped by the respect that was missing. If you build that, then maybe in time more will come. For now, let's begin with small steps. He accepted that, painfully. It was not what he wanted entirely. He wanted the house back the way it had been when he imagined it, The same roles, the same unquestioned closeness. He had to learn, as many of us do, that growth is not a return. It is a forward movement that sometimes leaves behind the comfort of old entanglements. In the months that followed, there were other adjustments. I took on small repairs personally, painting the side fence, tightening the loose banister rail. Dr. Rodrigo came by once with a cup of coffee and an honest grin. "You know," he said, "I've seen a lot of documents, but I've rarely seen someone treat the process with such calm dignity." I laughed then, thinking of the nights in the garage and the thin mattress. "We did what we had to do," he said, and the word had no triumph in it, but a recognition of work done. My life did not return to the way it had been before any single day, nor did I want it to. There were new habits, long walks with Sister Rosa, Thursday lunches with the ladies from the community center, a book club that argued about characters with too much passion. I kept the yellow folder with the crooked house drawing in a drawer, and sometimes when I opened it to smooth the corner of the paper, I would feel the years fold up like a map. The rocking chair creaked the familiar rhythm, and the kitchen table still bore the hammer marks where my husband had once repaired a leg at midnight. People asked me sometimes in the months after whether I regretted the path I had chosen. "Would you have done it differently?" they asked. I thought of the garage mattress and the nights I told myself the lullaby like a defense. I thought of my son's small hands and his tentative apologies. I thought of the neighbor's thermos and the knot of people who witnessed my life as it was. I would not change the choice to assert my dignity, but I would have wished for gentler ways had that been possible. The law felt like a tool, not a miracle or a cudgel, but a way to make visible what was true. I learned that protection has a cost. It demands clarity of purpose and the willingness to endure the discomfort of asserting boundaries. In return, it gives something essential: the right to keep the place where you have lived and the right to be treated as a person whose years are not disposable. There were moments when I allowed myself to be lighthearted. I repotted the marigolds and laughed at my inability to keep a philodendron alive. Sister Rosa and I argued over the correct recipe for orange marmalade, as if the war of senses was the only thing that mattered. The community group took a trip to the botanical gardens, and I leaned on the railing watching koi fish sweep in lazy arcs, feeling the motion of the world that kept going whether sorrow visited or not. The finality of the episode did not come like thunder. There was no gavel banged or courtroom scene that would befit a melodrama. What happened was the slow uncoiling of a life that had been compressed. The van left, the curtains were rehung, the old photographs reclaimed their places. The house grew into itself again, with small ceremonies that marked the change. Fresh bread on the table, a dinner with neighbors that had nothing to do with explanations, but everything to do with friendship. I still think about my son. I think about him with a mother's reluctant compassion. He calls now on Sundays, and we speak of small things: weather, a new book he reads, the names of his children. The relationship has cured into another shape, less dependent and more respectful, which in time has proven kinder to both of us. Forgiveness is a labor, not a single event. It is offered without erasing the past. Looking back, I see the central role of the man who called himself Dr. Rodrigo, not as a savior, but as the professional who translated facts into a language that a household could no longer ignore. His confession was procedural, a calm admission that when documentation is arranged, the truth has a way of obliging people to see it. In that, there was both mercy and justice. If you're watching and hearing this, you might be carrying a similar aching. Small humiliations that gather like dirt in the corners until you are unrecognizable to yourself. Know this: there are ways to set boundaries that preserve dignity. There are people, lawyers, neighbors, community groups who can help translate the facts of your life into actions that prevent further diminishment. Reach out to those you trust. Keep records. Tell someone. The law is not a magic solution, but it can be a tool to protect what you have built with years of work. Forgiveness does not require you to be open to harm again, Boundaries are not betrayal. They are protection. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who might need the courage to stand for themselves. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from, and, if you feel comfortable, a small line about what helped you regain your footing. For anyone in a similar situation, consider consulting a trusted attorney or an elder rights organization in your area to understand the options that apply to your local laws. And if you found this testimony meaningful, subscribe for more stories of ordinary courage and quiet justice.